The dagger was already in the wine before the cup ever reached the king's hand. Nobody in the great hall saw it happen. The candles were too bright, the music too loud, and the laughter of the northern lords too full of wine to notice the small vial that slipped from a silk sleeve and vanished into the golden cup meant for Alaric Voss, Alpha King of the Northern Realm. By the time he lifted that cup to his lips and smiled at the gathered nobles, the poison was already working its way toward his heart. He did not fall right away. He finished his toast. He laughed once, deep and warm, the way he always did, and clapped his cousin Doran Ashcombe on the shoulder. Then his knees gave out, and the great hall filled with screaming. That was 3 months ago. Now Alaric lay in a wide bed in the tallest tower of Voss Castle, his body still, his chest rising and falling so faintly that the physicians often leaned close just to be sure he still breathed. The court called it a deep and endless sleep. The healers called it something with a long, complicated name that meant they did not understand it either. His people simply called it a tragedy, and every day that passed made the whispers grow louder. A kingdom cannot wait forever for a king who might never open his eyes again. What none of them knew, what not even the finest physician in the realm suspected, was that Alaric Voss was awake. He had been awake since the 2nd week. He could not move his fingers, he could not turn his head or part his lips to speak. But behind his closed eyes, his mind was as sharp and alive as it had ever been, trapped inside a body that refused to answer him. He heard every footstep that crossed his chamber floor. He heard every whispered conversation that people believed was safe to have beside a sleeping king. He heard the truth, because no one bothers to lie to a man they think cannot hear them. And the truth, he was learning, was far more dangerous than any poison. "The council meets again this evening," said a voice near the window. It belonged to Lord Bennet Cole, his father's old advisor, a man Alaric had trusted since childhood. "They grow restless, my king. 3 months is a long time for a throne to sit empty in all but name." Alaric wanted to answer. He wanted to say that the throne was not empty, that he was right there, listening, waiting, furious at his own helplessness. Instead, he lay silent, a prisoner behind his own eyes, while Bennet sighed and left the room without another word. This was his life now. A parade of visitors who spoke over him, around him, sometimes about him, as though he were already a memory rather than a man. His cousin Doran visited most often, always with a concerned expression perfectly arranged on his face, always careful to be seen weeping at the king's bedside by at least one witness before he left. Alaric had once believed that grief. Now, after weeks of listening closely to every word Doran said and did not say, he was no longer certain of anything. It was the quiet hours he dreaded most, the long stretches between visits when the tower room held nothing but silence and his own tangled thoughts. In those hours, trapped and alone, Alaric had begun to feel something he had never allowed himself to feel as a king. Fear. Not fear of dying, fear of disappearing while he was still alive, forgotten inside his own skin, replaced by a cousin who wore sorrow like a costume. It was on an ordinary evening, when the sky outside his tower window had turned the color of a bruise, that everything changed. The door opened softly, without the heavy confidence of a noble's stride. The footsteps that crossed the floor were light and careful, the kind that belonged to someone who had learned early in life to take up as little space as possible. Alaric felt a cool cloth touch his forehead, and then he heard her voice for the first time. "You must be so tired of all of us talking about you like you're already gone," the voice said. It was young, a little rough at the edges, the voice of someone who worked with her hands and rarely had reason to speak softly to anyone who mattered. "I'm sorry. I know you can't hear me. But it feels wrong to just wipe your face and say nothing, like you're a piece of furniture." Alaric would have laughed if he could have. Instead, something inside his chest, something that had gone cold and hard over the last weeks, cracked open just slightly. Her name, he would learn later that same night, was Lyra. She was an Omega, and in the strict order of Voss Castle that placed her near the very bottom of the household staff, far below the stewards and healers who usually attended a king. She had been assigned to his chambers almost by accident, because none of the higher servants wanted the thankless, unpaid attention task of tending a man who could not thank them, could not notice them, could not even open his eyes to see their work. To everyone else in the castle, caring for a comatose king was a punishment disguised as a duty. To Lyra, it seemed, it was something else entirely. She changed his linens with careful hands. She read to him sometimes. Old letters she found stacked in his study when she was sent to fetch fresh ink and parchment. Letters from his mother, long dead, and from soldiers he had once commanded, who wrote to thank him for small kindnesses Alaric barely remembered doing. She hummed old songs under her breath while she worked, songs that sounded like they belonged to a village far from castle walls, and once, when she thought she was truly alone with him, she even talked about her own day, about the cook who had shouted at her for a burnt loaf of bread, about her small room near the kitchens that leaked when it rained, about missing her younger brother, who had been sent away to work on a farm 2 years ago and whom she had not seen since. Alaric listened to all of it, every word, with a hunger he did not fully understand at first. He realized, somewhere in that first week of her visits, that Lyra was the only person in the entire castle who spoke to him as though he were still a man and not a problem to be managed. The council spoke of him in terms of succession and stability. Doran spoke of him with performed sorrow. The physicians spoke of him in terms of symptoms and likely outcomes. Lyra spoke to him about burnt bread and leaking ceilings, and a brother she missed, and somehow that honesty meant more to him than every carefully worded speech given in his name by men who claimed to love him. "I heard the cook say you used to sneak into the kitchens when you were a boy," Lyra told him one evening, smiling faintly as she straightened his blankets. "Stealing honey cakes before they cooled. She still complains about it, you know, says you burned your fingers more than once, and never once admitted it hurt." It was true. Alaric had not thought about the kitchens, or the honey cakes, or the sting of hot sugar on his fingertips in years. Hearing it spoken aloud, by a stranger who had no reason to know or care about such a small memory, felt like sunlight breaking through a window he had forgotten existed. He began, in those long, silent hours after she left each night, to hold on to her visits the way a drowning man holds on to driftwood. He did not know her face. He could not see her at all, could only build a picture of her from her voice, and the sound of her footsteps, and the particular gentle way she moved his blankets, so as not to disturb him unnecessarily. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that she was the only real thing left in his world. Meanwhile, beyond the tower room, the kingdom continued to fracture. The council met without him, as it had for months, and the meetings grew sharper and less patient with every week that passed. Alaric could sometimes hear fragments of these meetings when the door to his chamber was left open, voices rising up the stone stairwell, arguing over trade routes and border disputes and, increasingly, over what should be done about a king who might never wake. "We cannot govern a kingdom by candlelight vigil," he heard one lord say one evening, his voice sharp with frustration. "The eastern border grows bold. They test us because they know our throne sits empty." "The throne is not empty," Bennett Coel's voice answered, weary but firm. "The king lives." "Living is not the same as ruling," came the reply, and no one in that stairwell argued the point. It was Doran who spoke next, and his voice, as always, carried the practiced warmth of a man who wanted very badly to be trusted. "I share your concern for the realm. Truly I do. My cousin is dear to me, more than any of you can know. But perhaps it is time we discussed what happens if he does not wake. A regency, temporary of course, until such time as—" The voices faded as footsteps moved further away, and Alaric was left alone with the cold certainty that his own cousin was already measuring the crown for another man's head. He wanted to scream. He wanted to sit up, to walk down those stairs, to remind every one of those lords, exactly who they served, and exactly what would happen to any man foolish enough to reach for a throne that was not his. Instead, he lay motionless, furious and helpless in equal measure, until the only sound left in the tower was his own silent breathing and the slow, steady beat of a heart that refused to give up, even when everything else in him wanted to. It was Lyra who found him that night, in whatever strange, wordless way a person can be found even while lying perfectly still. She came in late, later than usual, her steps quieter than ever, as though she did not wish to wake a castle that had already grown too used to grief. "Long day," she said softly, more to herself than to him, settling into the chair beside his bed. "Everyone downstairs is talking about the council meeting, about what happens if you don't wake up." Her voice caught slightly, just for a moment, before she steadied it. "I don't know why it matters so much to me. You don't know me. You've never even seen my face. But I don't think it's right. All of them talking about you like you're already a memory. You're still here. I don't care what the physicians say. I think some part of you is still here." Alaric felt something shift inside his chest, something he did not have a name for. If he could have wept in that moment, he would have. Instead, buried deep beneath layers of stillness and silence, something in him fought harder than it had in weeks to reach the surface. A single flicker of will, small and stubborn, refusing entirely to let go. He did not know it yet, lying trapped in that quiet tower room, but the girl who spoke to him without knowing he could hear was about to become the only person standing between him and a throne stolen out from under a king who was very much still alive. Outside his window, the last light of evening faded into darkness, and somewhere below in the castle, plans were already being made that would decide whether Alaric Voss ever opened his eyes again. Someone tried to move him in the middle of the night, and Alaric had no way to stop them. He felt the hands first, rough and unfamiliar, gripping his shoulders. Not Lyra's hands, not the careful, practiced touch of the physicians either. These hands were hurried, nervous, the grip of someone who did not want to be caught doing what they were doing. "Careful," a low voice muttered. "If he wakes while we're moving him, we're both finished." "He's not going to wake," a second voice answered, closer to his ear, edged with impatience. "He hasn't moved in 3 months. Just help me shift him so I can check under the mattress." Alaric lay rigid with silent fury as the two men searched his bed, his pillows, the small chest beside his bath. He understood, with a cold clarity, exactly what they were looking for. Somewhere in this room was something Doran did not want found, and these two men had been sent to find it before anyone else did. They left empty-handed, as far as Alaric could tell from the frustrated curses exchanged between them, and the door closed softly behind them, leaving him alone with a truth that chilled him more than the poison ever had. His own chambers were no longer safe. Whatever evidence existed of who had truly poisoned him, someone wanted it gone before he ever had the chance to wake and demand answers. He thought of Lyra in that moment, and a new fear settled over him, sharper than anything he had felt before. If men were willing to search his private chambers in the dead of night, what would they do to a servant girl who spent more time alone in that same room than anyone else in the castle? She came the next morning, as she always did, humming softly as she pushed open the heavy door, and Alaric felt something in his chest ease slightly just at the sound of her. "You'll never guess what happened," she said, setting down a basin of water. "Old Marta swears someone went through the linen closets last night, looking for something. She's convinced it was thieves, but I don't know. What would a thief want with your bed linens?" She laughed a little at her own joke, unaware of how close her guess had come to a very different truth. "Anyway, I brought you something today. It's silly, probably, but I thought you might like it." Alaric heard the soft rustle of paper, and then her voice again, quieter now, almost shy. "It's a story my mother used to tell me, about a prince who slept for 100 years under a curse, until someone brave enough loved him back to waking. I know it's just a children's tale. I know you're not under any curse. Not really." But I thought maybe it would be nice for you to hear a story where things turn out well in the end." She began to read, and Alaric listened, and for the length of that story, the fear that had gripped him all morning loosened its hold. Her voice moved through the tale with a warmth that made even the simplest words feel important, and somewhere in the middle of it, he found himself wishing, with an intensity that startled him, that he could see her face while she read. He tried, with everything he had, to imagine it. Kind eyes, he decided. She would have kind eyes. When the story ended, she sat quietly for a moment before speaking again, her voice dropping lower, as though sharing a secret. "I used to want someone to read that story to me, when I was small. My mother died before my brother was old enough to remember her voice. I've tried to keep the story alive for him, but he's so far away now, I don't know if he remembers it at all." Alaric felt a strange, aching kinship with her in that moment. He too had lost a mother young. He too knew what it meant to hold on to memory as though it were the last warm coal in a dying fire. He wanted desperately to tell her so, to offer her some small comfort in return for everything she had given him, without ever knowing it. Instead, all he could do was listen, and hope that somehow, some part of his gratitude reached her anyway. It was later that same week that Edgar Quinn, the royal physician, came to examine him again, and Alaric learned just how little the man actually understood about his condition. "There is no change," Edgar reported to Bennett Coale, his voice tired and clinical. "His body remains strong. His heart beats steadily, but the mind, I fear, may already be gone. Sometimes the body outlives what makes a man himself." Alaric wanted to scream that he was still there, that his mind had never left, that Edgar's fine training and careful instruments had simply failed to notice a truth too strange for any physician to expect. But no scream came, only silence, and the quiet click of the door as Edgar left the room, taking with him the last thread of hope that anyone with real authority might ever believe the king could still hear. Bennett lingered after the physician left, and for once, his voice was not addressed to some invisible counsel, but directly to Alaric, low and heavy with a grief he rarely allowed himself to show. "I promised your father I would look after you," Bennett said. "I am failing that promise more each day. Doran grows bolder. He speaks now not of if you wake, but of when you do not. I do not trust him, my king. I never have. But I have no proof of anything, only an old man's instinct, and instinct does not hold back an ambitious man for long." He paused, and Alaric felt the old advisor's hand rest briefly on his own, still and unmoving. "Wake up," Bennett said quietly. "Please, before it is too late for both of us." Alaric fought then, harder than he had fought in all the weeks since the poison first took him. He focused every scrap of will he had into the smallest possible task, the barest twitch of a single finger. Sweat he could not feel gathered on a brow he could not touch, and still nothing happened. His body remained as still and unyielding as stone, and Bennett, sighing, eventually rose and left the room, believing his words had fallen on nothing but silence. But something had shifted, deep beneath the surface of Alaric's stillness. Something small and stubborn that had not been there before. That evening, when Lyra returned, she found the king's hand resting slightly differently than she remembered leaving it that morning. She paused, frowning slightly, studying it for a long moment before shaking her head and dismissing it as her own imagination. She could not have known, not yet, that the ground beneath Voss Castle had already begun, ever so slightly, to shift. "You know," she said, settling into her usual chair, "I heard something odd today. One of the guards said Lord Ashcombe met with a merchant from the eastern border last night. Very late, very secret. Nobody thought much of it, but I don't know. It seemed strange to me. Why would a lord need to meet a stranger in the middle of the night, when the whole castle is asleep?" She had no idea how close her simple observation had come to the very heart of the plot against him. Alaric listened, cataloging every detail, storing it away with the same careful attention a soldier gives to enemy movements before a battle. Doran, a merchant, A secret late-night meeting. Pieces of a puzzle he could not yet see fully, but pieces nonetheless, gathered for him entirely by accident by the one person in the castle, with no reason to suspect she was gathering evidence at all. "I probably shouldn't be telling you all this," Lyra admitted with a small, self-conscious laugh. "It's not my place to gossip about the nobles, but you're the only one who never tells anyone what I say, so I suppose you're the safest person in the whole castle to talk to." If Alaric could have laughed, he would have. Safest person in the castle. He was beginning to believe the opposite was becoming true, that the longer she spent in this room, gathering secrets without meaning to, the more danger she might unknowingly walk into. He needed to warn her, he needed to protect her, and he had no way to do either, trapped as he was inside a body that would not yet obey him, no matter how desperately he willed it to move. As the days passed, Alaric grew more determined than ever to break free of his stillness. He practiced in the only way available to him, focusing every waking hour on that single finger, imagining the movement so vividly that surely, his body would eventually remember how to answer him. Sometimes he thought he felt something, the faintest twitch of muscle, gone before he could be certain it had happened at all. It was not enough. Not yet. But it was something, and something was more than he had possessed in months. Meanwhile, outside the tower, Doran Ashcombe moved carefully and patiently through the halls of Voss Castle, gathering allies with the same quiet skill he had once used to gather support for his cousin's own campaigns. He spoke of duty and stability. He spoke of the kingdom's need for a steady hand. He never once spoke openly of the crown, and yet everyone who spoke with him left the conversation somehow more certain that Doran Ashcombe was exactly the steady hand the kingdom needed. Only Bennet Cole remained unconvinced, watching Doran with the wary eyes of a man who had seen too many ambitious lords in his long years of service to be fooled by careful words and practiced sorrow. But Bennet was old, and tired, and increasingly alone in his suspicion, and he knew that suspicion alone would not be enough to stop what was already, quietly, beginning to move. In the tower room, as another evening settled into darkness, Lyra finished her visit with a small, private hope she rarely allowed herself to voice aloud. "Get better," she whispered, tucking his blanket carefully around his shoulders. "I don't know why it matters so much to me, but it does. This kingdom needs you, whether they say it out loud or not." She left, and the door closed, and Alaric lay alone in the darkness with her words echoing through him, and a single finger, hidden beneath the blanket she had just tucked around him, twitched once, faintly, entirely unseen. The ring went missing on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, Lyra's entire world had begun to collapse around her. It happened while she was carrying a tray of fresh linens down the corridor outside the king's chamber. Countess Priscilla Vane, a woman known throughout the castle for her sharp tongue and sharper ambitions, came storming toward her with 2 guards close behind, her face twisted into an expression of practiced outrage. "That is her," Priscilla announced, pointing a jeweled finger directly at Lyra. "That is the maid I saw lurking near the king's private chest yesterday evening." Lyra nearly dropped her tray. "I don't understand. I was only changing his bedding, my lady, as I do every day." "The king's signet ring is missing," Priscilla said, her voice carrying easily down the corridor, drawing the attention of every servant and guard within earshot. "A ring that has not left his hand since his father placed it there on his wedding day. And you are the only person besides his physician who has been alone with him these past months." "I would never," Lyra said, her voice shaking now, panic creeping into every word. "I have never even touched his hands beyond tending to him. Please, you must believe me." But belief, Lyra was quickly learning, mattered very little when accusation came dressed in silk and jewels. Within the hour, she found herself standing before a small gathering of the council, including Doran Ashcombe himself, who watched the proceedings with an expression of grave, sorrowful concern that did not once meet her eyes directly. "A serious accusation," Doran said, his voice smooth and measured. "Theft from the king himself. while he lies helpless and unable to defend his own possessions. I take no pleasure in this. Truly I do not. But we cannot allow such matters to go unexamined, not while my cousin remains unable to speak for himself. Lyra felt the weight of every eye in the room settle on her, and for the first time since she had come to Voss Castle 2 years ago, she understood exactly how little protection her position offered her. An Omega maid with no family of standing, no coin to offer in her defense, and no witness to speak on her behalf, stood little chance against the word of a noblewoman and the quiet suspicion of a council, eager to remove anyone with unsupervised access to the king's chambers. What none of them knew, what none of them could possibly have guessed, was that the king himself was listening to every word, and that inside his still and silent body, a fury unlike anything he had felt in months was building toward its breaking point. Alaric had heard Priscilla's accusation from his bed, carried faintly through the open door of his chamber, and he had known immediately, with absolute certainty, that it was a lie. He knew because he had felt Lyra's hands every single day for months, careful and gentle, never once straying anywhere near the small locked chest where his ring, along with a handful of other private items, had always been kept. He knew, too, exactly who benefited from removing her from his chambers, and the answer to that question filled him with a rage so complete it felt almost like fire beneath his skin. He fought. He fought harder than he had fought in all the weeks since the poison first took him, focusing every scrap of will he possessed into a single, desperate effort. "Move," he commanded himself. "Move, damn you, move." Nothing happened. His hand remained still beneath the blankets, unresponsive, and despair began to creep in at the edges of his fury. And then, just as he was ready to give up entirely, something shifted. It was small, smaller than a breath, but his smallest finger, the one closest to the edge of the bed, twitched, once, with a strength he had not managed in 3 long months. He did not know, in that moment, whether anyone had seen it. He could not see for himself, could not turn his head, could only feel the strange, electric sensation of a body beginning, however faintly, to answer him again. As it happened, someone had seen it. Lyra had been permitted, under close watch, to return to the king's chamber one final time, to collect her few belongings, before her dismissal was made official. Tears blurred her vision as she gathered a spare apron from the small chest near the window, and it was only by chance that her eyes fell upon the bed, upon the king's hand resting near the edge of the blanket. She froze. The smallest finger of his hand had moved. She was certain of it, though her mind immediately began offering every reasonable explanation to dismiss what she had seen. A trick of the light, her own exhausted eyes playing cruel games with her hope. And yet she stood rooted to the spot, staring at that hand, waiting, hardly daring to breathe. It moved again. "Your Majesty?" she whispered, so quietly that even she barely heard the words leave her own mouth. She crossed the room quickly, kneeling beside the bed, her earlier tears forgotten entirely. "Can you hear me? Please, if you can hear me, please move again." Alaric, gathering every remaining scrap of strength he possessed, forced his finger to twitch a 3rd time. Lyra pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, staring down at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. For a long moment she said nothing at all, simply looking at his still, closed eyes, searching for some sign, however small, of the man she now suspected had been listening to her this entire time. "All those months," she whispered finally, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "All those things I told you. You heard everything, didn't you?" His finger twitched once more, and though it was the smallest possible answer, it was enough. Lyra understood, in that instant, that she now held a secret capable of changing everything, and that speaking it aloud, carelessly, to the wrong person, could cost her far more than her position in the castle. If Doran Ashcombe was truly behind the false accusation against her, as she now strongly suspected, then he almost certainly had reason to fear a king who might one day wake and expose him. A king who could move, even slightly, was a king who might wake fully. And a king who might wake fully was a threat that ambitious men dealt with in far more permanent ways than a stolen ring accusation. She could not tell the council. She could not tell Priscilla, or Doran, or even kind old Bennett Coale. Not yet. Not until she understood more clearly what was truly happening, and who among them could be trusted. She could only tell the king himself, and hope, somehow, that he could find a way to help her prove it. "I have to leave the castle tomorrow," she told him softly, her voice barely above a whisper, even though they were entirely alone. "They think I stole your ring. I didn't. I swear to you I didn't, but no one will believe an Omega Maid over a countess's word. I don't know what to do. If I tell anyone what I just saw, they'll either think I'm lying to save myself, or worse, they'll believe me, and then whoever wants you gone might come back to finish what they started." Alaric listened, his mind racing through possibilities even as his body remained almost entirely still. He needed more than a single twitching finger. He needed a way to communicate clearly enough that Lyra could understand him, and he needed it quickly, before she was forced from the castle and out of his reach entirely. He focused everything he had into that one finger once more, and this time, instead of simply moving it, he tried something new. He moved it twice, deliberately, then paused, then moved it twice again. Lyra watched, frowning slightly in concentration, before understanding dawned slowly across her face. "Twice," she said softly. "You're trying to tell me something with twice." He moved it twice again in confirmation, and a small, disbelieving laugh escaped her, quickly followed by tears she no longer bothered to hide. "Two movements for yes," she said, testing the idea aloud. "Is that it? Two for yes?" His finger twitched twice, immediate and certain. "And nothing at all for no," she continued, working it out as she spoke. "Or maybe just once, so I know you heard the question." He answered once, testing her theory, and watched through senses he could not fully explain as her face broke into an expression of pure, astonished hope. They spent what little time remained to her that evening building this small, fragile language between them, question by careful question. "Are you truly aware?" Two twitches. "Have you been aware this whole time?" Two twitches. "Do you know who poisoned you?" A long pause, and then, finally, two slow, deliberate twitches that filled the room with a silence, heavier than anything Lyra had ever felt. "I have to go now," she whispered eventually, glancing anxiously toward the door as footsteps echoed somewhere down the corridor outside. "They'll come looking for me soon, but I'll find a way back. I promise you, I will find a way back into this castle, even if I have to sneak through every window myself." She reached out, hesitating only a moment, and pressed his still hand gently between both of hers. "Hold on," she said. "Please, whatever is happening here, whatever they're planning, hold on until I can find a way to help you." Alaric could not answer her with words. He could not tell her how deeply her promise steadied something inside him that had been slowly breaking apart for months. All he could do was twitch his finger once more, twice, a silent and certain yes, and hope, with everything he had left, that it would be enough to see her through whatever came next. Outside the tower, the sky had turned the deep purple of early evening, and somewhere in the halls below, Doran Ashcombe was already receiving word that the troublesome little maid had been successfully removed from the king's chambers, one small step closer to a throne he had no right to claim. Lyra did not leave the castle grounds the next morning. Instead, she hid in the one place she knew no one would think to search for a dismissed maid, the narrow servants' passage behind the kitchen pantry, where old crates and broken furniture had been stacked away for years. She had one night to decide what to do, and she spent every hour of it turning the same question over in her mind. If the king was truly aware, truly trapped inside a body that would not obey him, then someone in that castle had poisoned him and was actively working to keep him from ever waking again. That meant her own dismissal had not been a simple accident or petty cruelty. It had been a calculated move to separate her from a king who was slowly, secretly, beginning to communicate again. She needed help, and she needed someone who could not be easily bought or frightened into silence. Her thoughts turned to Colin Marsh, a young guard who had always treated her with quiet decency, one of the few in the castle who greeted servants by name rather than looking straight through them. She had heard him once, months ago, speaking with genuine sorrow about the king's condition, unlike so many others who had already begun speaking of Alaric Voss in the past tense. She found him early the next morning near the stables, checking the girth of his horse's saddle with the careful attention of a man glad for any task that kept his hands busy. "I need your help," Lyra said, keeping her voice low, glancing around to be certain no one else stood within earshot. "And I need you to believe something that is going to sound impossible." Colin studied her for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion clear on her face, the nervous energy in the way she kept glancing back toward the castle. "You're the maid who was dismissed yesterday, over the missing ring." "I didn't take it," Lyra said quickly. "I know that's what everyone assumes I would say, but that's not why I'm here. Colin, the king can hear us. He can hear everything. He's been aware this whole time, trapped inside his own body. And yesterday, right before they threw me out of his chambers, he moved his finger. On purpose. To answer a question I asked him." For a moment, Colin said nothing at all, and Lyra feared she had made a terrible mistake trusting him with something so dangerous. Then, slowly, he set down the saddle strap in his hands and looked at her with an intensity that surprised her. "I believe you," he said quietly. "Or at least, I want to believe you, because if it's true, it changes everything happening in this castle right now." He explained, in a low and careful voice, what he had witnessed over the past weeks, while standing guard near the council chambers. Lord Ashcombe meeting privately with men who were not members of the council, men whose names appeared nowhere in the official records of castle visitors, documents drawn up in secret, discussing terms of a regency that assumed, with unsettling confidence, that the king would never wake. And, strangest of all, a conversation Colin had overheard only days ago between Doran and a merchant from the eastern border. A conversation that had ended with the exchange of a small, sealed pouch and the merchant's hurried departure through a side gate rarely used by anyone at all. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Colin admitted. "Lords make strange arrangements all the time, and it's not my place to question them. But if the king truly is aware, if someone truly poisoned him and is now working to make certain he never wakes to name them, then that merchant might be exactly the kind of man who deals in poison." Lyra felt a chill settle over her despite the warm morning sun. "We need proof," she said. "Something more than a moved finger and a guard's suspicion. If we go to the council with nothing solid, Doran will simply say we're inventing stories, and then we'll both be finished, and the king will be left even more alone than before." Together, they began to piece together a plan, careful and quiet, built on the understanding that a single misstep could cost them both far more than their positions in Voss Castle. Colin, given his role as a guard, still had legitimate reason to move through most of the castle without drawing suspicion. He agreed to watch Doran's movements more closely, to note every visitor, every hushed conversation, every unusual absence from the castle grounds. Lyra, meanwhile, needed a way back into the king's chambers, both to continue building whatever fragile language of twitches and pauses might allow Alaric to communicate more clearly, and to search, however carefully, for any evidence the two nighttime intruders might have left behind or overlooked. That evening, using a servant's passage that Colin showed her, hidden behind a tapestry near the eastern kitchens, Lyra made her way back into the tower without being seen by a single guard or noble in the main halls of the castle. She found Alaric exactly as she had left him, still and silent, and yet somehow, the moment she entered the room, she felt certain he already knew she was there. "I'm back," she whispered, crossing quickly to his bedside. "I found someone who believes us. Colin Marsh, one of the guards. He's seen things too, strange meetings, secret visitors. We think we might know how they poisoned you, but we need proof before we can go to anyone with real power." She began to ask him questions again, carefully, patiently, building on the simple language they had started the day before. Was it Doran who arranged the poisoning? A long, heavy pause, and then, finally, 2 slow twitches. Was the merchant from the eastern border involved? Another pause, longer this time, as though Alaric himself was searching his own memory for certainty, before 2 twitches answered her again. "We're close," Lyra said, a fierce hope rising in her chest despite everything. "I know we're close. I just need to find something real, something I can show to people who won't simply dismiss it as gossip." She spent the next hour searching the room as carefully as she dared, mindful of leaving everything exactly as she found it, so no one would suspect anyone had been there at all. She checked the small locked chest near the window, the same one Priscilla claimed she had seen Lyra lurking near, and found it locked exactly as it should have been, the king's ring notably absent from its place inside. It was in the folds of a heavy curtain near the window, almost invisible in the shadows, that she finally found something. A small scrap of fabric, torn and dark with a stain she did not recognize, caught on a splinter of wood where the window frame had cracked. It smelled faintly bitter, unlike anything she had encountered before, and instinct told her, even before she fully understood why, that this small torn scrap was important. "I found something," she whispered excitedly, holding the fabric up, though she knew Alaric could not see it. "A piece of cloth, caught on the window frame. It's stained with something. I don't know what, but I don't think it's an accident it's here." She wrapped it carefully in a handkerchief and tucked it into the folds of her dress, determined to find someone who might understand what the stain truly meant. As she prepared to leave, careful once more to use the hidden servants' passage rather than risk the main halls, Alaric found himself fighting against his own stillness with a renewed and desperate urgency. He needed more than a finger. He needed a hand, an arm, anything that might allow him to protect the 2 people now risking everything on his behalf. He focused every scrap of strength he possessed, pouring all of his will into the effort, and this time, for the first time in 3 long months, his entire hand curled slightly against the blanket, a small but undeniable motion. Lyra, already halfway to the hidden passage, turned back just in time to see it, and her breath caught in her throat. "You're getting stronger," she breathed, hurrying back to his side. "Alaric, you're actually getting stronger." It was the first time she had spoken his name aloud, rather than his title, and something in the simple sound of it, spoken with such genuine warmth and hope, steadied him more than anything else had in the long months since the poison first took him. "I won't let them win," Lyra said fiercely, gripping his still hand between both of hers one final time before she had to go. "Whatever Doran is planning, whatever this stain turns out to mean, I promise you, I will not let them steal your throne while you're too weak to stop them yourself." She slipped away into the darkness of the hidden passage, the stained scrap of fabric tucked carefully against her chest, unaware that even now, unseen eyes had begun watching the tower more closely than either she or Colin realized, and that their careful, quiet plan had already, somewhere in the shadows of Voss Castle, begun to draw dangerous attention. Someone had followed her. Lyra realized it halfway across the castle courtyard, a prickling awareness on the back of her neck that made her slow her steps and glance casually over her shoulder. A figure in dark clothing stood near the stable entrance, too still, too deliberately positioned to be an ordinary guard going about his rounds. She kept walking, forcing her pace to remain steady, her heart pounding hard against her ribs while her mind raced through every possible explanation. She did not stop until she reached the small, cramped room she shared with 2 other former maids near the outer wall of the castle, and only then did she allow herself to breathe. The stained fabric was still tucked safely against her chest, and she pulled it free with trembling hands, studying it more closely now by the dim light of a single candle. The stain had dried to a strange, dark color, neither quite brown nor quite black, and the bitter smell she had noticed earlier still clung faintly to the cloth. She needed someone who understood poisons and medicines, someone who might recognize what this stain meant, but she could think of no one in the castle she trusted enough to ask, save perhaps Colin, and Colin knew as little about healing as she did herself. It was Colin, arriving quietly at her door just as the castle bells rang for the evening meal, who suggested a name she had not considered. "There's an old healer who lives just outside the castle walls," he said. "Greta Holloway. She used to serve in the castle infirmary years ago, before old age and stubbornness got her dismissed for arguing too often with the younger physicians. If anyone outside these walls can tell us what that stain means, it's her." They went together that evening, slipping out through a small side gate Colin knew was rarely guarded after dark, and made their way along a narrow path toward a modest cottage at the edge of the forest bordering the castle grounds. Smoke curled from its chimney, and the warm smell of herbs drifted through the open window as they approached. Greta answered the door herself, a small, sharp-eyed woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight braid, and studied them both for a long moment before stepping aside to let them in. "Guard and maid, out past curfew, looking like you've seen a ghost," she observed dryly. This had better be interesting. Lyra explained everything as quickly and clearly as she could. The poisoning, the coma, the strange finger movements that had begun to answer her questions, the stained fabric found caught on the window frame. Greta listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with every detail, until finally Lyra produced the small scrap of cloth and laid it carefully on the wooden table between them. Greta leaned close, sniffing the fabric carefully before touching it with the very tip of one finger and studying the residue left behind. "Nightshade root, mixed with something else, something I haven't smelled in years." She paused, frowning deeply. "Frost lily, a rare flower, grows only in the mountains far to the east. Combine the two, and you get a poison that slows the body without killing it outright. It mimics a deep, natural sleep so closely that even a skilled physician might mistake it for something the body did to itself, rather than something done to it. So the king wasn't just poisoned," Colin said slowly. "He was poisoned with something specifically meant to keep him alive but trapped. On purpose." "It would seem so," Greta agreed grimly. "And frost lily is not a flower anyone stumbles upon by accident. It must be sought out deliberately, likely purchased from a very specific kind of merchant, one who deals in rare and dangerous things for those willing to pay enormous sums for discretion." Lyra felt the pieces of the puzzle settling into place with a clarity that frightened her. A merchant from the eastern border, a secret nighttime meeting, a sealed pouch exchanged in shadow. Doran Ashcombe had not simply hoped for his cousin's death or decline. He had planned it, carefully and precisely, choosing a poison designed to leave the throne conveniently, plausibly empty, without ever technically committing murder in the eyes of the law. "This is proof," Lyra said, though even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her voice. "Isn't it? This has to be enough to bring to the council." Greta shook her head slowly, not unkindly. "A stained scrap of cloth and an old healer's word will convince no one of anything. Not against a lord as careful and well-connected as you describe. You need more. You need the merchant who sold the poison, or you need the king himself, awake and able to speak the truth with his own voice. Without one of those two things, all you have is a story that Lord Ashcombe will laugh away as nonsense invented by a desperate maid and a foolish young guard." The weight of that truth settled heavily over both of them as they made their way back toward the castle under cover of darkness. They were closer than they had been, closer than anyone else in the entire kingdom, and yet still nowhere near close enough. "We need to find the merchant," Colin said finally, as they approached the small side gate. "If he can be found, if he can be made to confess where that poison went and who purchased it, that would be evidence no one could easily dismiss. And if we can't find him," Lyra said quietly, then everything depends on the king waking up fully, before Doran finishes whatever he's planning. They parted ways near the kitchens, Colin returning to his post before his absence could be noticed, Lyra slipping back toward the hidden passage that led up into the tower. She needed to see Alaric again, needed to share everything she had learned, even though she knew it would likely bring him more fear than comfort. She found him just as she had left him, and settled into the chair beside his bed with a heavy sigh, the events of the evening weighing on her more than she had realized until that moment. "We found something," she told him softly. "A healer, outside the castle walls. She says the stain on that fabric is frost lily, mixed with nightshade, a poison meant to trap you like this on purpose, not to kill you outright. She says it isn't something anyone finds by accident. Someone had to seek it out deliberately." She paused, watching his still face carefully. It was Doran, wasn't it? All of it, planned from the very beginning. 2 slow, deliberate twitches answered her, and though she had already suspected the truth, hearing it confirmed so clearly still struck her like a physical blow. "We need more proof," she continued, her voice growing steadier even as her heart ached with the unfairness of it all. "A healer's word isn't enough against a lord like him. We need the merchant who sold the poison, or we need you, awake, able to stand before the council and speak the truth yourself." She reached out and took his hand gently in both of hers, the way she had done before, and felt, to her quiet astonishment, the faintest pressure of his fingers curling weakly around her own in response. "You're trying," she whispered, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. "I can feel it, Alaric. You're actually trying to hold my hand." It took everything he had, every last scrap of strength gathered slowly, over days of relentless effort. But Alaric managed to tighten his grip just slightly further, a silent promise carried through the smallest possible motion. "I am here. I am fighting. I will not leave you to face this alone. I'm going to find that merchant," Lyra said, her voice firm with a determination that surprised even herself. "Whatever it takes, wherever I have to look, I will find him, and I will bring back proof that no council in this kingdom can ignore." She stayed with him a while longer that night, speaking softly of smaller things, the way she often did, gentle and ordinary words that felt, in their own quiet way, like an anchor holding them both steady against the storm gathering just beyond the tower walls. And when she finally left, slipping once more into the hidden passage, neither of them yet knew that the dark figure who had followed her earlier that evening had not been a stranger at all, but someone far closer to the throne than either of them could have imagined, someone now fully aware that a servant girl and a castle guard had begun asking dangerous questions about a poison that was never meant to be found. Colin was summoned before Doran Ashcombe the very next morning, and the moment he stepped into the small private study where the Lord conducted his quieter business, he understood that their secret had not been nearly as well kept as he and Lyra had hoped. "Sit," Doran said pleasantly, gesturing to a chair across from his desk, his tone warm and easy, the tone of a man discussing nothing more serious than the weather. "I hear you've taken an interest in matters that don't usually concern the castle guard, merchants from the eastern border. Old healers living outside the walls. Strange, for a man whose duties involve little more than standing watch and checking gates." Colin kept his expression carefully neutral, years of guard training helping him hide the sudden lurch of fear in his chest. "I don't know what you mean, my lord. I simply do my rounds as assigned." "Of course," Doran said, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Perhaps I've been misinformed. It happens often enough in a castle this large, gossip traveling faster than truth ever can." He leaned back in his chair, studying Colin with an unhurried patience that felt far more threatening than any shouted accusation could have been. "Still, I would advise caution, Master Marsh. Loyalty is a fine quality in a guard, but loyalty misplaced can end a man's career quite abruptly. Sometimes it ends rather more than a career." The threat, though never spoken plainly, hung heavy in the air between them, and Colin left that study with his heart pounding and a cold certainty settling over him. Doran knew. Perhaps not everything, perhaps not the full extent of what he and Lyra had discovered, but enough to know they were a danger worth silencing. He found Lyra later that day near the kitchens, and pulled her quickly into the shadow of a narrow storage passage before speaking, his voice low and urgent. "Doran called me in this morning. He knows we've been asking questions. He didn't say it outright, but the warning was clear enough. We need to be careful, Lyra, more careful than we have been." Lyra's face paled, but her resolve did not waver. "Then we need to move faster. If he's already suspicious, waiting will only give him more time to cover his tracks, or worse." "There's something else," Colin said, his expression grim. "I did some asking of my own before he called me in. The merchant who met with Doran, the one from the eastern border, he's been seen recently at an inn near the river crossing, 2 days' ride from here. If we can reach him before Doran realizes we know where to look, we might finally get the proof we need." The decision, once made, left little room for hesitation. Lyra could not simply vanish from the castle for 2 days without drawing suspicion, not after her dismissal had already placed her under a cloud of doubt. Colin, as a guard, had somewhat more freedom of movement, but even he could not easily explain an unauthorized journey so far from the castle walls. In the end, it was Bennett Cole, unexpectedly, who provided the solution. Lyra had not intended to involve the old advisor, wary of trusting anyone connected too closely to the council, but circumstances left her with little choice. She found him alone in the castle library late that evening, poring over old records with the tired, careful attention of a man searching for something he feared he might never find. "I need your help," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. "And I need you to trust me, even though I have no right to ask it of you." Bennett listened to her account with a stillness that gave away nothing of his thoughts, his eyes narrowing slightly at the mention of frost lily and nightshade, sharpening further still at the description of the merchant Colin had located near the river crossing. "I have long suspected Doran," he admitted finally, his voice heavy with old grief. "I loved his father like a brother, and I have watched Doran grow from a good and honest boy into something far colder over these past years. I did not want to believe it of him. I still do not want to believe it. But I have served 3 kings in my lifetime, and I know the particular hunger that grows in men who stand always one step behind a crown they believe should have been theirs." He agreed, after a long moment of consideration, to arrange travel papers for Colin under the guise of an official errand to the border towns, a task ordinary enough not to draw suspicion from the council. Lyra, meanwhile, would remain behind, continuing her secret visits to the king's chambers, watching over Alaric, while Colin rode to find the merchant who held the final piece of proof they so desperately needed. "Be careful," Bennett warned them both, his old eyes grave. "If Doran suspects even for a moment what you are truly attempting, he will not hesitate to remove either of you from his path entirely. He has already proven himself willing to poison his own cousin and king. A guard and a maid will trouble his conscience far less." Colin left before dawn the next morning, riding hard toward the river crossing with nothing but a small pouch of coin, Bennett's forged travel papers, and a fierce determination not to fail the 2 people now depending on him. Lyra, left behind in the castle, found the days that followed almost unbearably long, filled with a constant, gnawing worry that pressed against her chest every waking hour. She continued her visits to Alaric each evening, using the hidden passage Colin had shown her, and found a strange comfort in simply sitting beside him, even as fear for Colin's safety weighed heavily on her heart. "He should reach the river crossing by tomorrow," she told Alaric one evening, her voice tight with worry she could not fully hide. "I keep telling myself he's careful, that he knows how to handle himself, but I can't stop thinking about what Doran said to him, about loyalty ending more than careers." Alaric, listening as always, found himself wishing more desperately than ever for the strength to move, to act, to do anything beyond simply lying still while 2 people he had come to care for deeply risked everything on his behalf. He focused his efforts each night on small, private tests of his own growing strength, curling his fingers, tensing the muscles of his hand, once even managing to shift his wrist slightly against the blanket, though the effort left him feeling as exhausted as if he had run for miles. "You're getting stronger every day," Lyra observed one evening, noticing the small but steady progress with quiet wonder. "At this rate, you might be able to move your whole arm soon. Maybe even sit up, eventually." She smiled faintly, though worry still shadowed her eyes. "I just hope we have enough time before Doran forces the council's hand." Her fear was not unfounded. Word had already begun spreading through the castle that Doran intended to bring a formal proposal before the full council within the week, a proposal to establish a temporary regency under his authority, citing the king's continued and seemingly permanent lack of response as sufficient grounds for the realm's urgent stability. Once such a regency was formally established, Lyra feared reversing it, even with proof of poisoning, might prove far more difficult than preventing it in the first place. 3 days after Colin's departure, a message finally arrived, smuggled carefully into the castle by a young stable boy Colin had trusted along the way, folded small enough to hide inside a horseshoe nail pouch. "Found the merchant," it read in Colin's hurried handwriting. "He is frightened and reluctant to speak, but not entirely unwilling, given the right persuasion. I believe I can bring him back with proof of the sale, but it will take a few more days. Keep the king safe. Keep yourself safer still. Trust no one within the castle walls who has not already earned it." Lyra read the message twice before carefully burning it in the small fireplace of her room, her heart caught somewhere between hope and dread. A few more days. She did not know if they had a few more days to spare, not with Doran's regency proposal looming ever closer, and not with the growing certainty that somewhere within the castle, unseen eyes continued watching her every movement, waiting for the smallest mistake that would finally give them reason to remove her from the king's side for good. They came for Lyra on the 4th night, while she was still crouched beside the king's bed, halfway through, describing a memory of her brother's laughter to fill the heavy silence of the tower room. The door burst open without warning, and 2 of Doran's personal guards filled the doorway, their expressions grim and unyielding. Behind them, Priscilla Vane stood with an air of triumphant satisfaction that made Lyra's stomach twist with dread. "There she is," Priscilla said coldly. "Sneaking back into the king's chambers, exactly as I suspected she would. Take her." "I've done nothing wrong," Lyra said, rising quickly, positioning herself instinctively between the guards and the still, silent king behind her. "I was only checking that his blankets were properly arranged. Nothing more. A dismissed maid has no business anywhere near the king's chambers, arranged blankets or otherwise," Priscilla replied sharply. "You will explain yourself to Lord Ashcombe directly, and you will explain how you managed to slip past guards who were specifically instructed to watch for you." Lyra's mind raced desperately as the guards moved to take hold of her arms. She could not allow herself to be dragged before Doran. Not now, not when Colin remained somewhere on the road with the merchant's confession still out of reach. Not when the smallest mistake might cost them everything they had worked so hard to uncover. Behind her, hidden from the view of everyone in the doorway, Alaric felt a fury unlike anything he had experienced in the entire 3 months of his captivity. Every instinct he possessed, every protective impulse built over years of ruling and defending his people, roared to life inside him with a force that refused, absolutely refused, to remain still any longer. He fought against his own stillness with everything he had left, pouring every last reserve of strength into a single, desperate effort. "Move," he commanded his body, the way he had commanded it every night for weeks. "Move now, when it matters more than it has ever mattered before." And this time, for the first time since the poison first took him, his entire arm lifted from the blanket, trembling with the effort, and his fingers curled weakly but unmistakably around the edge of the sheet. It was Priscilla who saw it first, her triumphant expression collapsing instantly into shock. "The king!" she breathed, taking an involuntary step backward. He moved. I saw him move. The guards holding Lyra's arms froze, their grip loosening in startled confusion as all eyes in the room turned toward the bed. Alaric, gathering every remaining scrap of strength, forced his eyes to open for the first time in 3 long months. The light in the room, dim as it was, struck him like a physical blow after so long spent in darkness, and for a moment his vision swam, blurred shapes and shadows slowly resolving into the startled faces surrounding his bed. He found Lyra's face among them almost immediately, and something inside him, some deep and desperate need he had carried through every silent hour of his captivity, finally settled at the sight of her. She was exactly as he had imagined, and entirely more than he had imagined all at once. Wide, frightened eyes, a face marked by exhaustion and fierce determination in equal measure, and an expression, when she finally met his gaze, of such overwhelming relief that it nearly undid him entirely. "Your Majesty," one of the guards stammered, releasing Lyra's arm entirely now, dropping into an uncertain, hurried bow. Alaric tried to speak, and found his voice little more than a rough, broken whisper after months of complete disuse. "Let her go," he managed, the words costing him tremendous effort. "This maid has done nothing but care for me faithfully every single day I have lain here. She will not be touched again." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly torn between their orders from Doran and the undeniable reality of a king who had just spoken directly before them. Priscilla, recovering some of her composure, stepped forward with a forced smile that did not quite hide the panic beneath it. "Your Majesty, this is wonderful news, truly wonderful. We must send for the physician immediately, and of course inform Lord Ashcombe, who will be overjoyed to learn of your recovery." "No," Alaric said, his voice growing slightly stronger with each word, though the effort still left him trembling. "No one leaves this room to inform anyone of anything until I understand exactly what has happened here tonight. Why were guards sent to remove a maid from my chambers in the middle of the night, on whose authority, and why?" The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, and Alaric, watching the guards shift uneasily, understood immediately that whatever authority had sent them here tonight, they were not eager to name it aloud in front of their newly awakened king. "Bring Bennett Cowell to me," Alaric said finally, his strength ebbing rapidly now, the effort of speaking and holding his eyes open proving almost more than his weakened body could sustain. No one else. "Only Bennett, and quickly, before whoever sent you here tonight has the chance to hear that I have woken and decide what to do about it." One of the guards hurried from the room immediately, grateful, it seemed, for any excuse to escape the tension gathering thick and dangerous in the air. Priscilla lingered a moment longer, her eyes darting nervously between the king and Lyra, before she too excused herself with a hurried, unconvincing bow, no doubt already racing to find Doran and warn him of what had happened. The moment the door closed behind them, leaving only Lyra and the remaining guard, who now stood awkwardly near the doorway, Lyra rushed to the king's bedside, tears finally spilling freely down her face. "You're awake," she said, her voice breaking with disbelief and joy tangled together. "I can't believe it. I can't believe you're actually awake." "Because of you," Alaric said softly, his hand, still trembling with the effort, finding hers and holding on with what little strength he possessed. "Every word you spoke to me these past months, every kindness you showed a man you believed could not hear you, kept me from disappearing entirely. I owe you a debt I do not know how I will ever fully repay." "You don't owe me anything," Lyra said, shaking her head fiercely even through her tears. "I only did what felt right. But Alaric, we don't have much time. Doran will know within the hour that you've woken, and he still has powerful allies within the castle, and Colin still hasn't returned with proof of the poisoning. If Doran realizes his plans are about to fail entirely, there's no telling what he might attempt next." Alaric's expression hardened, the last of his earlier weakness giving way, slowly, to the sharp and steady resolve of a king reclaiming his throne. "Then we must move quickly as well. I may not yet have the strength to stand on my own, but I have more than enough strength left to make certain my cousin answers for what he has done, one way or another, before this night is finished." Bennett Cole arrived moments later, and the old advisor's composed expression crumbled entirely at the sight of his king, awake and speaking, propped weakly against his pillows with Lyra still at his side. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and knelt beside the bed, tears gathering unashamed in his tired old eyes. "My king," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I feared I would never again hear your voice. There is little time for reunions, old friend. Welcome as they are," Alaric said, gripping Bennett's hand as firmly as his weakened strength allowed. "Doran poisoned me. I have known it for weeks, trapped and listening while he moved to steal what was never his to take. Lyra and a young guard named Colin Marsh have been gathering proof, and Colin should be returning soon with a merchant's confession regarding the poison itself. Until he arrives, I need you to ensure that Doran's regency proposal does not move forward, and that no harm comes to either Lyra or Colin in the meantime." Bennett nodded gravely, already rising to his feet with renewed purpose despite his age. "I will gather what allies remain loyal to you within the council this very night. But Doran will not simply stand aside once he learns you have woken, my king. He has come too far, invested too much, to surrender everything without a fight." Outside the tower, somewhere in the darkened halls of Voss Castle, Priscilla Vane hurried breathlessly toward Doran Ashcomb's private chambers, carrying news that would set in motion the final, desperate movements of a plot 3 months in the making. And Alaric Voss, weak but finally, truly awake, braced himself for the battle that remained ahead, grateful beyond words that he would not face it alone. Doran Ashcombe received the news of his cousin's awakening with a calm that unsettled even Priscilla, who had expected panic, or at least some flicker of fear crossing his composed features. Instead, he simply set down the goblet of wine he had been holding, his expression thoughtful, almost distant, as though rearranging pieces on a board only he could see. "How much does he know?" Doran asked quietly. "I don't know," Priscilla admitted. "He said only that the maid had done nothing wrong and demanded Bennett Cole be brought to him. He seemed weak, barely able to hold his own head up. Whatever strength he has, it cannot be much, not after 3 months lying still." "Weak or not, a king who can speak is a king who can accuse," Doran said, rising from his chair with slow, deliberate purpose. "We must move the regency proposal forward immediately. Tonight if possible, before he has the chance to gather enough strength or enough allies to challenge it formally." "Tonight," Priscilla repeated, startled. "The council has not been properly assembled. Surely such haste will only raise more suspicion, not less." "Suspicion matters far less than speed now," Doran replied coldly. "If my cousin regains his full strength before the council formally establishes stability under my authority, then every plan I have carefully built these past months collapses entirely, and I will answer for far more than mere suspicion. Send word to every council member still loyal to our cause. Tell them the king's health remains gravely uncertain despite tonight's brief and troubling episode, and that the realm cannot afford further delay. It was, Alaric would later understand, a masterful and utterly ruthless final gamble. One final attempt to seize the throne through sheer speed before the truth could catch up with him. Bennett Cole, moving as quickly as his aging body allowed, worked through the remaining hours of that night to counter Doran's efforts, waking council members loyal to the crown, explaining in careful, urgent whispers that the king had indeed woken, however weakly, and that any regency proposal brought before the council now would be nothing less than treason disguised as concern. Alaric, meanwhile, remained in his chambers, forcing his body through every exercise his weakened muscles could endure, determined to gather enough strength to stand, however briefly, before the council if it became necessary. Lyra stayed at his side through every exhausting effort, offering steady encouragement, gentle corrections, and an unwavering presence that Alaric found himself leaning on more with every passing hour. Not merely for physical support, but for something far deeper he was only beginning to allow himself to name. "You don't have to prove anything tonight," Lyra said softly, watching him grimace through another attempt to shift his legs beneath the blankets. "Bennett is handling the council. You need to rest, or you'll collapse before you ever reach the throne room." "I have rested for 3 months," Alaric replied, though the effort of speaking still left him slightly breathless. "I will not lie still a moment longer while my cousin attempts to steal what belongs to my people, not while there remains even the smallest chance I might stand and stop him myself." It was near dawn when the second message arrived, carried again by the same trusted stable boy, this time delivered directly into Lyra's hands, as she slipped briefly from the tower to check for any word from Colin. "We have him," the message read, Colin's handwriting hurried but triumphant. "The merchant has confessed everything, in writing, with his own signature. Frost Lily sold directly to Lord Ashcombe 6 months past, arranged through a private meeting he insisted remain secret. We ride for the castle now. We will arrive by midday." Relief flooded through Lyra so completely that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. She hurried back to the tower, the message clutched tightly in her hand, and found Alaric struggling through another slow, determined attempt to sit fully upright against his pillows. "Colin has the confession," she said breathlessly, kneeling beside the bed. "Written and signed by the merchant himself. They're riding back now. They'll be here by midday." Alaric closed his eyes briefly, a wave of relief passing visibly across his exhausted features. "Then we only need to hold Doran back until midday. If the council formally establishes his regency before Colin arrives, undoing it may prove far harder than preventing it." "Bennett is doing everything he can," Lyra assured him. "He's gathered enough loyal council members to insist on delay, at least until midday, citing your own recovery as reason enough to wait and see how quickly your strength returns." But Doran, it seemed, had anticipated exactly this kind of delay, and had already begun moving pieces of his own to counter it. Word reached the tower shortly after sunrise that Doran had summoned an emergency session of the council, citing the king's continued fragile condition as urgent cause for concern, and had produced, to the horror of those still loyal to Alaric, a statement supposedly written and signed by Edgar Quinn himself, the royal physician, warning that any premature strain placed upon the king's fragile recovery risked a sudden and fatal collapse. "He's using Edgar's own caution against us," Bennett reported grimly, arriving briefly at the tower to update them both, his face drawn with worry. "The physician's statement is not entirely false, merely twisted to suit Doran's purposes. Edgar did express caution about strain, but nothing so dire as collapse." Still, fear spreads quickly among frightened men, and several council members are now arguing that establishing a temporary regency, even now that you've woken, remains the wisest course until your full recovery is certain. "Then I will go to the council myself," Alaric said, pushing himself further upright despite Lyra's immediate protest. "Let them see with their own eyes that I am not so fragile as Doran claims." "You can barely sit up," Lyra argued, real fear coloring her voice now. "Walking into a full council session, standing before them, it could genuinely harm you, Alaric. Doran isn't entirely wrong about the danger, even if he's using it for his own purposes. And if I remain here, hidden away in this tower, while my own cousin steals my throne through fear and false statements, what good does my survival do my people then?" Alaric asked, his voice gentler now, though no less determined. "I would rather collapse attempting to defend my kingdom than survive comfortably while it slips away from me entirely." Lyra studied him for a long moment, torn between fierce protectiveness and a reluctant, aching understanding of exactly why he needed to do this. Finally, she nodded, though tears gathered unshed in her eyes. "Then I'm coming with you," she said firmly. "You'll need someone at your side who can catch you if your strength gives out, and someone who can vouch for exactly what you overheard while everyone believed you were beyond hearing anything at all." Bennett hesitated only briefly before agreeing, recognizing the fierce resolve in both their expressions as something not easily argued against. The council session begins within the hour. If we are to challenge Doran's claims before the Regency is formally established, we must move now, and hope desperately that Colin arrives with that confession before matters are decided beyond our ability to reverse them. Together, with Bennett supporting one side and Lyra the other, Alaric Voss rose fully from his bed for the first time in 3 months, his legs trembling badly beneath him, every muscle screaming in protest after so long spent motionless. It took every ounce of will he possessed simply to remain standing, let alone to take the first slow, unsteady steps toward the door. "One step at a time," Lyra murmured, her arm firm and steady beneath his. "That's all you need to manage right now. One step, and then another." And so, leaning heavily on the two people who had risked everything to see him through his darkest months, Alaric Voss began the long, difficult journey down from his tower chamber toward the great council hall, where his cousin waited, unaware that the throne he believed nearly within his grasp was about to be challenged by the very king he had tried so carefully, so patiently, to erase. The great council hall fell into stunned silence the moment the doors opened, and Alaric Voss appeared, pale and trembling but undeniably alive, supported on either side by Bennett Cole and a maid few of the assembled lords even recognized. Doran, standing at the front of the hall mid-sentence, froze entirely, his carefully composed expression cracking for just an instant before he mastered himself once more. "Cousin," he said, his voice carrying just enough surprise to sound genuine to anyone who did not know him well. "You should be resting. Whatever strength allowed you to rise, I fear you risk everything by pushing yourself so soon." "I have rested long enough," Alaric replied, his voice steadier now than it had been in the tower, strengthened by sheer determination as he made his slow way toward the front of the hall. "Long enough to hear every word spoken in this castle these past 3 months, cousin, including quite a few words I imagine you wish I had never heard at all." A murmur swept through the gathered council, and Doran's eyes narrowed slightly, though his composure held. "I don't understand your meaning, your majesty." "I have done nothing these past months but attempt to hold this kingdom steady in your absence, exactly as any loyal relative would." "Loyal," Alaric repeated, reaching the front of the hall at last, releasing his grip on Bennett and Lyra just enough to stand, unsteady but upright, facing his cousin directly. "Is that what you call arranging a private meeting with a merchant from the eastern border, 6 months past, to purchase a rare poison known as frost lily?" The color drained visibly from Doran's face, though he recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that fooled no one in the silent hall. "A wild accusation, cousin, and no proof to support it beyond, what, feverish dreams from your months of illness?" "Not dreams," Alaric said. "I was awake, Doran. Awake this entire time, trapped inside a body that would not answer me, while you visited my chambers wearing grief you never truly felt, and while your allies searched my rooms in the dead of night for anything that might expose you." He turned slightly toward the assembled council, raising his voice enough to carry through the entire hall. "I heard every conversation held carelessly beside a man everyone believed could no longer hear anything at all." The hall erupted into startled whispers, council members exchanging alarmed glances, several rising halfway from their seats before Bennett raised a steadying hand, calling for order. "This is absurd," Doran said, his voice rising now, the first genuine cracks of panic showing beneath his careful composure. "You expect this council to believe the word of a man freshly woken from months of illness, over the service and loyalty I have shown this kingdom throughout your entire absence?" It was in that moment, as the hall doors burst open once more, that Colin Marsh strode in, travel-worn and exhausted from days of hard riding, a nervous, weathered merchant following close behind him under careful guard. "Perhaps," Colin said, breathing hard but standing tall, "the council would believe the word of the man who sold Lord Ashcombe the poison himself." Every eye in the hall turned toward the merchant, who shifted uncomfortably beneath the sudden weight of attention, glancing nervously between Doran's furious glare and the king's steady, expectant gaze. "Speak," Alaric commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of a king, reclaiming his throne despite his weakened body. "Tell this council exactly what you told my guard, and I promise you, whatever fear Lord Ashcombe has instilled in you, my justice will prove far more merciful than his continued freedom would allow." The merchant swallowed hard, then finally, haltingly, told his story. The private meeting 6 months ago. The specific request for frost lily, a poison known for its ability to mimic natural sleep so convincingly that even skilled physicians rarely suspected foul play. The enormous sum paid in silence purchasing coin. The written confession, already signed and sealed, which Colin now stepped forward to place directly into Bennett Coel's waiting hands. Doran's composure shattered entirely as the merchant's words filled the silent hall, his face twisting first with fury, then with the cold, desperate calculation of a man realizing every carefully built plan had finally, completely collapsed around him. "This proves nothing," he said, though his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "A frightened merchant will say anything under threat, and a maid and a guard, conveniently, are the only witnesses to any of this." "I am also a witness," Alaric said quietly, and the hall fell silent once more at the weight in his voice. "I heard you yourself, cousin, speaking with Priscilla just 3 nights past, discussing how much longer you might safely wait before pressing the council toward your regency. I heard you order guards to search my chambers for anything that might expose your involvement. I heard every careful, patient step you took these past months, believing entirely that I would never wake to name you." Doran's eyes darted around the hall, searching desperately for allies who might still stand with him, and found instead only wary, uncertain faces, council members who had followed his lead out of practicality rather than true loyalty, now quickly recalculating where their safety truly lay. "Guards," Bennett said firmly, stepping forward at last with the full weight of his long years of service behind him. "Lord Ashcombe is to be held under close watch until the full council can properly review the evidence presented here today." For a moment, it seemed Doran might resist, his hand twitching toward the ceremonial dagger at his belt. A final, desperate impulse quickly abandoned as several guards moved to surround him, their loyalty, now that the truth stood plainly before them, no longer in question. "You will regret this," Doran said quietly, his eyes locked on Alaric with a bitterness that had clearly been building for years, long before any poison had ever touched a cup of wine. "You were always given everything, cousin. The throne, the loyalty of our people, love freely offered wherever you went. I worked for every ounce of respect I ever earned, and still it was never enough, never equal to what simply fell into your hands by accident of birth." "Perhaps that is true," Alaric said, his voice heavy now with an exhaustion that went far beyond his weakened body. "But you had a place at my side, Doran, a place of genuine trust and purpose, and you chose poison over patience, betrayal over honest ambition. Whatever unfairness you believed you suffered, nothing justified what you did to me, or to the people of this kingdom who deserved better from both of us." As the guards led Doran from the hall, his protests finally fading into silence, Alaric felt his weakened legs finally begin to give way beneath the accumulated strain of the morning's efforts. It was Lyra who caught him, steady and sure, guiding him gently into a chair. Someone hurried forward just in time. "You did it," she whispered, kneeling beside him, relief and exhaustion mingling in her voice. "It's over, Alaric. You did it." "We did it," he corrected softly, finding her hand and holding it with what remained of his strength. "I would still be lying silent in that tower, forgotten and helpless, if not for you. Every part of this victory belongs to you as much as it does to me." The council hall slowly began to settle, lords and advisors alike processing the sudden, dramatic collapse of a plot 3 months in the careful making, while Bennett Coel moved efficiently through the aftermath, already beginning the work of restoring proper order to a kingdom that had come dangerously close to falling into the hands of a man who had never deserved to rule it. But for Alaric, sitting exhausted and trembling in that chair, surrounded by the wreckage of his cousin's ambition, none of it mattered quite as much as the steady, warm presence of the woman kneeling beside him, the same woman who had spoken kindly to a silent king when the rest of the world had already begun to forget him, and who had, in doing so, given him every reason in the world to fight his way back to waking. The weeks that followed Doran Ashcombe's arrest passed in a blur of careful, exhausting work, as Alaric slowly rebuilt both his strength and his kingdom, one difficult day at a time. Doran himself was stripped of his title and his lands, tried formally before the full council with the merchant's signed confession and Alaric's own testimony standing as undeniable proof of his betrayal. He was sentenced to permanent exile, forbidden from ever again setting foot within the borders of the northern realm, a punishment Alaric had chosen personally, over the harsher penalties several council members had argued for. "He is still my cousin," Alaric explained quietly to Bennett, on the evening the sentence was finally decided. "Whatever he became, whatever poison of ambition and resentment grew inside him long before he ever poisoned my wine, I cannot bring myself to end his life over it. Exile will have to be justice enough." Bennett, who had known Alaric since childhood, only nodded, unsurprised by the mercy in his king's decision, though he privately doubted Doran would ever fully understand or appreciate the leniency shown to him. Priscilla Vane, whose involvement in the false accusation against Lyra proved to run deeper than mere loyalty to Doran, was stripped of her title and sent from the castle in disgrace, her attempt to remove Lyra from the king's chambers ultimately serving only to expose her own complicity in the wider plot. Lyra, meanwhile, found her entire world transformed in ways she was still struggling to fully comprehend. The king she had once tended in quiet, unnoticed silence now insisted, gently but firmly, that she remain close to him throughout his recovery, and the castle staff, who had once looked straight through her as though she were invisible, now watched her with open curiosity, uncertain how to treat a maid who had somehow become essential to their king's survival. "They don't quite know what to make of me," Lyra admitted one afternoon, sitting beside Alaric's window as he practiced walking slowly back and forth across the room, his strength returning steadily now with each passing week. "An Omega maid who somehow ended up at the center of everything. I catch them whispering whenever I pass." "Let them whisper," Alaric said, pausing to rest against the windowsill, his breathing still slightly labored, though far stronger than it had been. "I care very little what anyone whispers, Lyra, so long as they eventually understand the truth of what you did for me. You spoke to a silent, forgotten king as though he still mattered, when everyone else had already begun writing him into the past. I do not know that I would have found the strength to fight my way back, if not for you." Lyra felt heat rise in her cheeks, still unused to hearing such open gratitude from a man who now stood, however unsteadily, as the ruler of an entire kingdom. "I only did what felt right," she said softly, echoing words she had spoken to him once before, back when she believed he could not hear her at all. "I never expected anything in return." "I know," Alaric said, crossing the room slowly to sit beside her, his eyes holding hers with a warmth that had grown steadily, quietly, throughout every week of his recovery. "That is precisely why what you gave me mattered so much. You never once acted out of hope for reward, or fear of punishment, or any of the calculations that seem to guide so many within these castle walls. You simply chose kindness, again and again, when no one was watching, when you believed there was nothing at all to gain from it." He reached for her hand, the same hand that had once held his still, unresponsive fingers through so many long, uncertain months, and this time his grip was steady and sure. "I would like you to remain here," he said quietly. "Not as a maid tending my chambers, Lyra, but as someone whose place beside me I have come to value beyond anything else in this kingdom. I understand this is sudden, and I understand the difference in our stations makes such a request complicated in the eyes of many. But I have spent 3 long months trapped in silence, believing I might never again have the chance to speak honestly to anyone, and I find I no longer have the patience for careful, complicated waiting when it comes to matters of the heart. Lyra stared at him, her breath catching in her throat, hardly daring to believe the words she was hearing. Alaric, I'm an Omega Maid. The council, the nobles, they'll never accept. They will accept whatever I decide, Alaric said gently, though there was steel beneath the softness of his voice, the quiet certainty of a king who had nearly lost everything and had no intention of allowing fear or tradition to cost him anything more. I very nearly lost my kingdom to a man who valued ambition over honesty, who wore the mask of loyalty while planning betrayal beneath it. I will not now turn away from the one person who showed me genuine, unguarded kindness, simply because tradition suggests I should look elsewhere for companionship. Tears gathered in Lyra's eyes, though this time they carried none of the fear or desperation of the weeks before, only a quiet, overwhelming joy she had never quite allowed herself to imagine possible. I never wanted anything from you, she whispered. I only wanted you to wake. You gave me far more than waking, Alaric said softly, drawing her hand to his lips. In a gesture so unexpectedly gentle, it stole the breath from her entirely. You gave me a reason worth waking for. In the months that followed, Voss Castle slowly settled into a new and steadier rhythm under its recovered king. Bennett Coel, exhausted but deeply relieved, resumed his role as trusted advisor, now with the added satisfaction of watching Alaric govern with a wisdom sharpened, rather than diminished, by everything he had endured. Colin Marsh, whose loyalty and courage had proven instrumental in uncovering the truth, was raised to a position of genuine trust within the castle guard, his quiet decency finally recognized and rewarded as it long deserved to be. And Lyra, once an overlooked Omega Maid assigned to the thankless task of tending a king no one believed would ever wake again, found herself, improbably and entirely without seeking it, standing at the very center of the kingdom she had once served in silence. The castle staff who had whispered about her in those early uncertain weeks eventually grew to understand what Alaric himself had recognized far sooner than any of them. That kindness offered without expectation of reward often mattered more than any grand gesture performed for an audience. That the quietest, most overlooked people in any kingdom sometimes carried within them a strength and honesty far greater than those who wore titles and privilege as though they were owed rather than earned. On a warm evening many months after the poison had first taken hold of him, Alaric stood once more at the same tower window where he had lain trapped and silent for so long, watching the sun set gently over the kingdom he had so nearly lost. Lyra stood beside him, her hand resting easily in his, no longer trembling with fear or uncertainty, but steady and warm and entirely sure of the place she now held, not merely within the castle walls, but within the heart of the king she had once spoken to when no one else believed there was anyone left inside to hear. "Do you ever think about those months?" Lyra asked quietly, watching the last light fade slowly across the horizon. Lying there, listening to everything, unable to answer any of it? "Every day," Alaric admitted honestly. "But I do not think of them with only sorrow anymore. I think of your voice, filling that silent room night after night, refusing to let me disappear entirely. I think of honey cakes and burnt bread, and a story about a sleeping prince you once believed I would never truly hear." He turned to face her fully, his expression warm with a certainty that had only grown stronger with every passing month. "I think, most of all, that those silent months gave me something I might never have found otherwise. They gave me you." Lyra smiled, leaning gently against him as the last light of evening gave way to the soft, settled darkness of a kingdom finally at peace, its throne secure, its king awake and steady, and its future, at long last, resting safely in the hands of two people who had found each other in the quietest, most unexpected of silences, and had refused, against every obstacle placed before them, to let that silence win.